I've mentioned two individuals who have a lot to do with our being here today, and there's actually a third one that I now get to mention. And this is someone who, where to start with my gratitude personally for someone who was very instrumental in my own entry into the field of positive psychology, was enormously instrumental collaborating immediately with Marty and Ray Fowler. I like to think of this as sort of the trinity, maybe, not sure, of positive psychology, the birth of positive psychology. And this is someone who has an enormous erudition that he brings to the field that complements the empirical work that is being done so powerfully around the world. He also contributes a very important rite of passage. Spelling and pronouncing his name correctly is one of the greatest early challenges that students of positive psychology around the world encounter. He is currently the Distinguished Professor of Psychology and Management and the founding co-director of the Quality of Life Research Center at Claremont Graduate University. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Mihai Csikszentmihalyi.
Well, this is a surprise. This is not about me. I am here simply to introduce the next speaker, who is an old friend, Jonathan Haidt here, who I met, I think, the first time about 25 years ago or so, when he came as a postdoc to the University of Chicago, where I was teaching at the time. And he became immediately a kind of showing what the spark that has then turned into a flame, not by now, a spark of interest, curiosity, and great, interesting scholarship that he, at Chicago, he was doing, at that time, psychological anthropology with a colleague of mine, Rick Schrader, and he was combining psychological, anthropological knowledge in new ways, and he has been continuing to do that ever since. After Chicago, I think the next time we met was in the Cayman Islands, where we were at a small conference, and my memory of that was that if you ever get shipwrecked somewhere in the Caribbean or in the Pacific, you should keep close to Jonathan, because he probably has some good stuff in his pockets to feed to the sharks or whoever else may be attacking him. Because we were surrounded in the blue hole of the Grand Cayman, where these enormous stingrays would come. And we were underwater, and it was scary, but he had something always for them to eat, and they would come and swoop and eat, and he got to be very popular with the stingrays there. And ever since, he has had a very distinguished career, which I'm not going to bore you with, except to mention one thing, that now that we're having the doctoral program in positive psychology at Claremont, one of the most popular topics with our students is Jonathan's work with elevation, which you will probably, you know already, but you will hear more about it during these days. And there have been symposia now here on elevation, and our students love that concept, and several of them have published already. on elevation, replicating some and extending Jonathan's work, so that I wish that he moves on to some other topic, otherwise we'll be elevating all the time there, and it's kind of heavy lifting. But so I'm very glad to announce one of the really rising stars and introduce them to you, and you will probably be echoing my admiration for his work after you listen to him. Okay, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. I have never, ever had an introduction like that one. And one of the best things about it is that I get to be introduced as a rising star. See, that's the thing about, when you go back a long way with someone, they still think of you as being young. So I was very active in those early years of positive psychology, the Cayman Islands conferences, the Akumal conferences. And then I kind of got out of I wasn't as active for a while, and now I'm coming back in. It's just wonderful to see how the field has grown in size, grown in our international hopes early on have been fully realized. So I'm having great fun at this conference. I'm really excited about the state of our field. So as I said, this is back in 1998, I guess, Mike and Marty put out a call for young people who were interested in a variety of topics that seemed related to positive aspects of human experience and human flourishing. And so I had been studying morality, and I had just started studying these positive moral emotions. So I answered the call, and me and about, I think it was 18 of us or so, came down to Akumal. This was, I forget the name of it, something, Yalku, whatever. Anyway, it's a beautiful place where you can go snorkeling, and of course that was an early hallmark of positive psychology meetings, was we all took Barb Fredrickson very seriously, and so let's go to the most beautiful places we can to be as creative as we can. It was great fun. I just did a search for Akumal, and this is actually the thing that came up. I think this was actually Marty's house. If anyone was there, that looks familiar now. It was, okay. That was what? Oh, the Grateful, okay, I think that's one that Marty rented, but it's the Grateful Dead's house. Anyway, so while there, it was a very exciting time. This was like January of 1999. It was a very exciting time, and we felt that we were creating a new field. And what do you do when you've got a bunch of young people creating a field? You write a manifesto. And so a bunch of us got together and wrote this, we called it the manifesto. But we came up with a consensual definition of positive psychology. And we laid out, and this was a group effort, but just a few of us drafted it up. And we laid out, let me go back. So we laid out what we thought the field might look like. And the field was really off and running. And the strategy of the leaders early on was to invest in young people, knowing that they weren't going to change older people's minds so much as they were going to really excite young people with the possibilities of this new phase in psychology, this new direction in psychology. And I changed the course of my research, changed the course of my teaching. I took a cue from Marty, who had just started teaching a positive psychology class, said it was the most fun class he'd ever taught. So I did the same, and it was so much fun. It led to me formulating my first book, The Happiness Hypothesis, which is about ancient ideas and what they knew about what the ancients knew about happiness. So I wrote that book, but then I returned to my main line of research, which is on moral psychology, and I began to focus on political psychology, on why left and right were so divided, and that took me away from positive psychology. My second book is a kind of a darker book, and it got me involved with politics and the increasing, the decline of civility, the rise of polarization in American politics. And so I was kind of moving away from positive psychology somewhat. And I happened to move to New York City for a year in order to promote the book. I just wanted to be in New York. I had young kids. I didn't want to travel. And I found a one-year position at the business school at Stern, at NYU Stern. And I had no interest in business at the time. But I thought it would be a great way to live in New York. And as soon as I got there, Occupy Wall Street broke out. And suddenly, capitalism was really, really interesting from the perspective of morality. It's what everybody was talking about. And so Stern ended up offering me a job, and I took it. And my next book, I just started actually writing last week, so it's going to be at least 2 years before it comes out. But my next book will be about capitalism and morality. And it turns out that this topic is bringing me right back to positive psychology. Because a big question is, what does capitalism do to people? How does it change their lives? And as you'll see, or at least as I'll argue, it has profound, transformative, and generally amazingly positive effects with some asterisks and caveats. So let's see. So the way into this topic of capitalism and happiness is through a comment. It's an offhand comment that Marty made. I think this was at one of the summer institutes that we used to have in Delaware, and a number of the researchers here went through that. And it was, over wine one night, and Marty said, how can we increase the total tonnage of human happiness? And, I love Marty, and he's absolutely brilliant, but he sometimes he'll say things that are not euphonious. They don't sound really good. And the tonnage of happiness, I think I made fun of him at the time, and I laughed at it. But upon reflection, because look, it's like happiness. Is that the symbol of happiness? Happiness. That's what we want. But the more I've thought about it, the more I think that Marty was right. That this actually is a good way to think about it. And I think part of what was happening was that he and some of the other elders or leaders of the field were already talking with economists, thinking about economics. Ed and Marty in 2004 wrote this really important article where they proposed that we shouldn't just measure GDP, we should be measuring people's happiness, measure it like any other indicator. And then this led to these amazing reports. I only finally read these reports just a few months ago. If you haven't read these 3 reports that have come out, they're put out by economists. We used to always say in psychology, we'd say that economists have no idea how people work. They have no idea about human nature. But these 3 economists, Hellawell, Laird, and Sachs, have really done a fantastic job. These reports are very, very rich, and they really show the potential of positive psychology to guide policy. So very, very exciting development. So the world really is moving this way. Now, part of our original approach when we made this manifesto and we talked about what the field would look like is we thought there were 3 areas of focus. There's the study of positive subjective states, happiness. There's the study of virtues and the good person, and so that became the VIA taxonomy. And then we were going to have a whole area on positive institutions. And that proved to be the hardest by far. Have we ever found positive sociology? Anyone here know? Did we ever find a positive sociologist? I can't remember. We had grand dreams of linking up with all the other social sciences, and there's been some progress, but this has proved to be by far the hardest. But this is really where I think the big effects are. It's great to make people a little happier, to help people cultivate virtues, but you only really change the world, I think, when you change societies, when you change the nature of what threats people feel, what people are doing every day. And so how could you really do that? How could you really increase the total tonnage of human happiness by the most amount the fastest? That was Marty's challenge to us that night in Delaware. And so if you think about it that way, well, let's think about the whole world. Think of all the people in the world. And what's the most powerful way to raise happiness quickly? Any ideas? You want to just call out? What's your best candidate for the force that could really do it? Money. We could airdrop money all over the world. What else? What? Capital? What? Water? What was that? Education. Okay, so a lot of ideas. We could, health, education, there's all sorts of things that we could do that would improve people's lives. And of course, when people are sick, when they're curing diseases, that has a huge effect. So there are lots of things that you could do. But I've come to believe that by far the biggest and fastest thing, this is not a prediction, this is actually just a recognition of what has been happening. What has been happening, the biggest transformation of the human species, probably in our history in terms of the rapidity of it, is this. I found this on the internet. I thought it expressed the sentiment very well. But capitalism has changed the world in the most dramatic way possibly ever. at least in the last, if you focus on a few decade span. To illustrate this, let me show you. These are the two, I think these are the two most important and I'd say mind-blowing graphs I've ever seen. So this is a graph, it's based on GDP per capita, constant dollars for different regions of the world. And many of you can't read the years, but on the left is the year 1, and then the year 1000, 1500. So what you see is that on all the continents, everybody was living on the equivalent of about what we would call today about $1 a day. Everybody was living at starvation level, except for the king or the queen or the 1/10 of 1%. But everybody else was hungry and poor. And then you can see this blue line here rises around 1500. And right there you can see the origin of mercantile capitalism. That's the kind of capitalism where the Europeans figured out how to take boats and fund them with various schemes of pooling money so that you can send a mission to the east and you can load it up with spices. And a boat full of spices in Jakarta is not worth nearly as much as that same boatload in London, probably 1,000 times as much in London. So you're not making anything. But just by moving stuff from one place to another, you're vastly increasing the wealth of the world. And you can see Europe doubles. The average wealth in Europe doubles. They're not making anything, but just by mercantile capitalism, commerce is increasing the wealth of Europeans. And it goes on, and it goes up a little bit. And as you can see, the gigantic transformation happens around 1800, which of course is the birth of industrial capitalism. This is when Europeans discover how to harness water power and then steam power, how to make things. Make them cheaply with division of labor. And the first country to really master the art, well, Britain first, but then the USA is the one that surpasses all others in industrial capitalism. So that by 1950, as you can see there, the USA has become the first mass prosperity society. It's created the first gigantic increase in wealth that was then broadly shared. Not universally shared, but at least not just the top few percent. And the reason I love this graph, and the reason I show it this way is because you can kind of feel not exactly the struggle, but you can feel sort of the slow progress of the world, and then this big upspike there. But it's really the next step, which is what's so mind-blowing, which is just what happens in the next 50 years, and it's this. Okay, so however far we came to 1950, the whole world has gone so much further in the 50 years after that than they did in the 2,000 years before. Then the world is really, really changing. And the flip side of this, as wealth rises, it's not just that some people are getting rich. Of course, there's inequality, and we're all talking about that a lot. But the flip side is that extreme poverty plummets. So this is how the world has done on extreme poverty. On the left edge is 1820. It's estimated that 95% of all human beings in 1820 were living in abject poverty. Disease, hunger, and gradually with industrial capitalism, rising wealth, that drops. But over the course of the next, 120 years, it drops from 95%. Oops, oh no, I blew it. I blew the punchline. All right, as you can see, it drops from 95% down to about 70% over the course of 120 years. Well, that's pretty good in historical terms, but it's what happens next. So that giant spike after 1950, it's a giant plummeting of the poverty figures. And in fact, if you trace this out, we are headed to single digits of people on this planet living in extreme poverty. And that's because trade and commerce has linked up Africa and Asia to the global economy, allowing specialization, rising wealth. So the story here is probably the most morally significant event of our lifetimes on the positive side. We can all point to atrocities, World War II. There are many things to point to on the negative side. But on the positive side, this is the big story of the last 100 years, 1,000 years. It's fantastic. Now, of course, there's a downside. There's economic instability. There are sometimes breadlines or hunger. Capitalism is not just a bowl of cherries. In the 20th century, there were alternatives. Russia seemed to provide an example of an alternative. China also tried to offer alternatives. I just spent 3 months traveling across Asia with my family to do research for the next book. And in a little, wonderful little museum in Shanghai, the Propaganda Poster Art Center, I saw this amazing poster from the 1950s in China. And I'll just zoom in on it. It's a portrayal of the ugly side of capitalism as seen by communists. So Wall Street controls, drops the money down to the political leaders. That's Truman carrying the bomb, and capitalism is just terrible. But it's not that that's so interesting. It's what's happening on the ground. capitalism is racism, it's violence, it's pornography, it's degradation, it's the worst thing in the world. And the Chinese had an alternative. They had a different way to live, a different way to work. It wasn't about greed. It was about working together to produce, not out of greed, but out of love for the community. And many people in the 20th century thought that this was much more beautiful. They were attracted to this vision, but nobody was ever able to get it to actually work. So this is GDP in China. In 1952, it was negligible. On a world scale, China barely registered. Really, almost nothing was made there. There was not much to distribute. And they tried various things, the Great Leap Forward, in rejecting markets, in banning markets, in banning people selling stuff. They inadvertently caused the death of 30 to 50 million people, starved to death, because nobody grew any wheat. Nobody grew rice. And so it was a massive disaster. So then the Chinese have been ever inventive, and the leaders were not so doctrinaire that they wouldn't try new things. They did try new things. They tried the Cultural Revolution. Again, nothing happens. Deng Xiaoping then comes in after Mao dies, and he says, poverty is not socialism. And he says, let's let some people get rich. And so he introduces a little bit of private enterprise, first in Shenzhen, and market-based reforms. Bang, China is now the biggest economy in the world, not in raw terms, but purchasing power parity, and it will soon be the biggest economy in the world. So again, capitalism is the most powerful transformative force ever known, ever discovered for societies. The transformation is so powerful, you can see it from outer space. North and South Korea were equally poor. They were both devastated by the war. They were among the poorest countries on Earth in the 1950s, by 1960. And then they went off on very diverging paths. North Korea didn't get any richer, and South Korea did. You can see it from outer space. This is, obviously, they have electricity in South Korea, and they barely have any in North Korea. This is what I would call a really, really, really big effect. And it's not just money. It's not just that capitalism makes some people rich. Maybe they're rich and unhappy. Well, this is a graph of happiness. This is from those World Happiness Reports. And to a first approximation, this is a graph of GDP. With two well-known exceptions. As many of us know, the two areas that deviate from the prediction line are that the Latin Americans are happier than you would expect given their wealth, and some of the East Asian countries show up as less happy given their wealth. But with those two corrections, the graph of happiness around the world matches pretty well the graph of GDP. And I'm not saying GDP is the only thing, not at all. That would be heresy in this group. But the economists who did this report did this a great favor. They break down the different happiness scores into the contributing components. And there are many components. GDP is not most of the story. But it is the largest single piece of the story out of the 6 pieces that they try to quantify. So those blue bars are the part of happiness that is due to simple wealth. And what they conclude in this report is that happiness goes along with countries. When countries are wealthy, there's a package of things that go together. Wealth tends to then go along with freedom, rule of law, and a good safety net. And that's why the Northern Europeans tend to score on top. America's never on top. Our safety net is not nearly as good as in Northern Europe. That's one of the reasons. The countries on the bottom don't have any of that, and especially not money, not GDP. So if we come back to Marty's question, how can we increase the total tonnage of happiness? A very sort of simple-minded answer, which might offend some people here, is, well, let's just have more container ships, more commerce, more capitalism. The more capitalism, the better, if what I've told you is true. Now, things are a little bit more complicated than that. I think we need to think about what kind of capitalism rather than just more. But I think any consideration of global happiness has to have capitalism, trade, commerce, and economic institutions at the heart of the inquiry. Well, if capitalism is so good, why are we so polarized on it? Now, Americans are very polarized on this. Europeans too. Countries that are that are rising rapidly are less polarized on the question of capitalism. But sort of the older country, I mean, American and European countries are quite polarized. So this is data from the American citizens, Pew data. people who are conservative and or, well, actually, I think it's combined, but it's the same. Conservative Republicans, 66% positive towards capitalism, only 29% negative. But people on the left are actually 50-50. Americans on the left are as likely to disapprove as to approve of capitalism. And for those of you who work in universities like me, then the imbalance is much, much starker. When was the last time you ever heard anyone in a university say anything good about capitalism? It's quite rare. Socialism, on the other hand, the people on the right are almost unanimous. They hate it, and people on the left like socialism more than capitalism. So why? Why are Americans and many Europeans so divided? Soon after I moved to the business school, and I was studying Occupy Wall Street, I went down there a few times, I was talking with people, and then I'd go back to the business school, and it was so positive about entrepreneurship and social enterprise and solving problems and creating value. And I started to hear different networks of meaning, different sort of, not closed, but different stories that were sort of closed worlds that made perfect sense and had a history to them. And I just sort of wrote out what I thought those stories were. And then a few months ago, I just hired a video production company to animate them. I wrote the script, and they found images. And so what I'd like to do now is show you those videos. They're just 90 seconds long each. So just watch them and see what you think. Oh, so just, yeah. So obviously on the left, there's a lot of criticism of capitalism. That's Paris. This is actually Korea. So here are those stories. Just watch the two stories and just see whether they resonate. Which one feels more right or true to you as a description of capitalism?
Once upon a time, work was real and authentic. Farmers raised crops, and craftsmen made goods with their own hands. But then, capitalism was invented, and darkness spread across the land as the smokestacks of the Industrial Revolution covered everything in soot. The capitalists became ever more skilled at extracting productivity from workers and pocketing the gains from their labor. The workers eventually fought back by unionizing. In the early 20th century, as the brutality and stupidity of capitalism were exposed, many governments granted workers some protection from the predators. Democratic welfare states were born. But the capitalists and their right-wing cronies were unrelenting. And in many countries, they have destroyed the unions, slashed regulations, and given the corporations free rein to exploit at will. So, the rich get richer, the rest of us get poorer, our democracy gets weaker, and the planet gets hotter. It is now the duty of every decent person to join the fight against global capitalism and the super predators it has unleashed upon us.
Okay, so that's the first story. So just how did it make you feel? And now here's the second story. And what you might notice is that the second story has exactly the same structure and plot. I just changed some of the elements of the story. So here we go.
Once upon a time, almost everyone was a peasant, a serf, or a slave. Kings and feudal lords took most of what people produced, so nobody had much reason to work hard. But then in the 17th century, capitalism was invented and the liberation began. In England, Holland, and America, they discovered that when you give people property rights, the rule of law, and free markets, you turn on a switch in their hearts. People want to work when they can keep the fruits of their labor. They want to invent new products, provide for their children, and be useful to others. Free market capitalism enables them to do these things. In the 20th century, some countries embraced communism and centralized planning, always with the same result: shortages of everything, including food and freedom. But countries that embraced capitalism have grown prosperous in a single generation. Yet, despite the evidence of history, the left-wing egalitarians are unrelenting, and whenever they get control of a government, their first target is economic freedom. The egalitarians don't want to live in a world in which people who create more value for others get to enjoy more wealth for themselves. They'd rather that everyone be equal and equally poor. It is now the duty of every decent person to join the fight to protect capitalism and to extend its blessings to all of humankind.
Okay, so thanks. Okay, so they're cartoonish, they're extreme, but I'd like to find out which ones resonate. I want to do it in this way. Actually, I have no idea what the political orientation of positive psychology is. Can't even guess. No, but so please raise. So I'm going to ask you if you're on the left, on the right, or in the center. So if you're on the left, in whatever your country is here, Democrat. So if you'd say you're on the left, politically, or liberal, or progressive, please raise your hand high right now. Okay, so, and now just those of you who just raised your hand, which story resonates more? Which story do you think is more accurate or correct? Just the people on the left, do you think it's the first story? Raise your hand. Okay, and raise your hand if you think it's the second story. Okay, so about evenly split. So the people on the left are about evenly split between the two stories. Okay, now how many people here are on the right or conservative? Please raise your hand high. Okay, so it's much more conservative than social psychology, which would only have 1 or 2 people in it, but it still is probably about 5-to-1 left-right or 4-to-1 left-right. So the field leans heavily left, which is not surprising. Psychology and education, many fields lean heavily left. So just the 20 or so conservatives that we have here. Just you guys, raise your hand if you resonate more or you think is correct. The first one, the exploitation story, raise your hand high. 1, okay. And conservatives, raise your hand if you go with the second story as the more correct one. Okay, all of you. All right, and people in the center, raise your hand if you say you're in the center or non-political. Okay, so that's more than there are conservatives. That's okay, and centrists. Well, all right, raise your hand if you resonate to the first video, the exploitation video. 2. And raise your hand if you think the second one is the correct one. Okay, so the centrists and conservatives go with the liberation video, and as we saw in the Pew data, the people on the left are evenly split between the two stories. So it's important to know that about our field, that we come to the topic where the dominant group politically, I don't mean dominant like oppressed, I just mean largest numerically group politically, is ambivalent about capitalism. So, conservative graduate students, you got the field open to yourself. Go study it. All right. So what do we do now? We have these two stories circulating, and they make it really difficult for us to get good economic policy. Even our economists can't agree on basic questions. Like if we raise the minimum wage, will the disemployment effects be large or small? They can't agree, because if they're on one side, they say one thing. If they're on the other, they say the other, about factual questions. So we're kind of stuck with these two stories. What do we do now? Do we need a third story? And I'll confess to you that I made up the title of my book before I knew the answer. I don't know what the third story is yet. I don't know if we'll need one. But I do think that we can begin talking about a positive psychology of capitalism. Now, of course, we already are. We have lots of people doing great work already. I mean, we have economists working on this. We have the Positive Organizational Scholarship group at Michigan. David Cooperrider, I hear, gave a fantastic talk this morning on how business can play this really positive, transformative role. So it's not as though this is new. I'm not making this up that we need to suddenly start studying business and capitalism. But I think I can add just a few things from the perspective of moral psychology to what that would look like. So I'll just mention 3 points, and I'll give some examples. 3 points that I think should characterize positive psychology's approach to capitalism. One is that the essential feature that makes it so good is non-zero sumness. That was Robert Wright's awkward term, a really important book from, I think, the 1999 or so. Where he talks about how evolution is a sort of a ever-increasing sequence of better cooperation, more cooperation, which generates more positive sum gains. A libertarian philosopher, David Schmitz, gave a talk at NYU last year, and he just made this offhand comment, which he doesn't even remember making, but I checked it with him. He said, sure, you can attribute that to me. He said, at its best, a free market society is a game that you can only win by making other people better off. If you make your money by creating a good or service that people choose to buy because it's worth it to them, God bless you. And that's the way the game should be. Now, of course, we don't live in societies in which that's the only way to get rich. And that's where we need to put our efforts. How can we get from where we are now closer to that ideal? And the key, I believe, is business ethics. So I've started a collaboration with many other researchers. David Mayer is around here somewhere. And there is so much good research on what it takes to get ethics in organizations. I mean, you can try to teach it directly, but that's really hard. And as social psychologists know, if you make small changes to environments, you often get huge effects. So we have a team. There's 22 of us, including some people who are well known. And we are the collaborators. We pool our knowledge. We make information accessible. So the heart of the site, and I urge you to go here if you have any interest in business or business ethics or business consulting. The heart of the site is the research tab, and we have all kinds of topics. We have one page on ethics pays, the research showing that in the long run, ethically run companies pay off better for their shareholders. In the long run, ethics is a really, really good idea just from a financial point of view. I won't go into the page, but you can find it there. On our, just another example, our leadership page, we have an introduction. What is the topic really about? There's a list of specific pieces of advice, all of which are backed by research. And we've begun because, I thought originally if we just put the information out there, people will use it. But that's not the way the world works. So we've begun partnering with some consultants, including some positive psychologists, Margaret Greenberg and Senya Maimin from MAP 1, I believe it was, from the very first MAP class. I invite those of you, actually raise your hand if you in some way are a consultant for businesses, you go into businesses and help change them. Raise your hand high. Wow, a lot of you. Okay. So if you sometimes do work in which the client's problem is that they have a bad ethical climate and they might have some interest in actually trying some interventions, trying some techniques to improve it, please contact me. We are looking to partner with consultants who understand. I'm an academic. I don't really know what happens inside a business. I just read about them. But we want to work with consultants. All right, so that's the first point, is that the essential insight is non-zero sumness, gains from trade and exchange, and how do you get more of it? A second feature that I think must characterize our approach is to see left and right as being like yin and yang. And this is the view that I really came to in my research on morality and politics. I used to be very much on the left. I grew up hating Ronald Reagan and the Republicans. And I actually started my research on political psychology in the hope of helping the Democrats to win, because they had no idea, Al Gore had no idea how to talk about morality in a way that Americans would respond to. And by studying conservatives and conservative literature, I actually came to see that, wow, there's a whole set of ideas that I'd never encountered, many of which are very good and are right about certain things. And I came to see that each side, none of us can understand the whole of a really complex and emotionally arousing topic like politics or society. Each side has a piece of the puzzle. You have to respect that, and you can't let your natural self-righteousness or tribalism let you reject the other side. And in this case, I think what I'm seeing over and over again is that the left is always standing for decency and the right for dynamism. So for example, should we let companies just fire people for no reason whenever they want? What do you think? Well, if you're in France, or in most places in Europe, they tend to prioritize decency over dynamism. They say, no, that would be cruel. So we have all kinds of laws so that you can't just fire people. And that's very decent. But of course, that makes it more difficult for companies to hire. They're reluctant to hire. So you can protect the workers, but that often comes at a cost to dynamism. That's the Europeans' choice. That's a cultural fact about Europe. America, we go more for cutthroat Anglo-Saxon capitalism. We tend to value dynamism more, but especially if you're a Republican, not a Democrat. So this simple formulation, you need both. You have to remember both. And each side tends to stand up for one, so it's a yin-yang sort of thing. The third point that I want to make is that I think the ultimate goal of the positive psychology of capitalism would be to answer what I'll call the $100 trillion question. Here's how it goes. This is a graph of gross world product. What is the total amount of value created in the world? This particular graph that I found goes back to 1960. And as you can see, it goes way, way up. The first part is mostly the United States and then Japan, and then the last part is almost all Asia. So the total value of things and services on this planet is going up, up, up. And by the time my book comes out, it'll be around $100 trillion, probably. Now, America was the first mass prosperity society. We were the first to have to deal with the question of, okay, now what? So, our golden age of prosperity is sometimes thought of as the post-war, the boom. Most people could afford a car, often rather a nice car. Kitchen life changed. Kitchens changed dramatically. This was a huge step forward. This is an image from the 1950s, and by the 1960s, you have all this futuristic, fun stuff. So, modernism, modern consumerism, first really comes to the United States, but along with it come doubts. And this is one of course, the most famous lines in positive psychology. Robert F. Kennedy, a few months before he was assassinated, GDP measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And this is a line that you'll hear often in the positive psychology literature. It captures a deep truth, and one that the World Happiness Survey, those people are really working on. What now? What do we do now? So I think the $100 trillion question is, what is a flourishing capitalist society in the 21st century? In the 20th century, the question was capitalism versus communism versus something else. That question has been settled. There is nothing else. There is no alternative. There can be small communities with a few dozen people, but if you've got millions of people in your country, there is no way to feed them other than, to some extent, a free market society, but there are many versions of capitalism. So where do you want your country to go? And there is no one right answer. There's no one best form of capitalism, although my survey of people in Europe and Asia and all across Asia and in America seems to suggest that the Scandinavians have the most attractive model. That's the one that most people seem to say, oh, yeah, we want that kind of capitalism. But here's the funny thing. Here's why it's so hard to answer this question. Because capitalism, by raising wealth so rapidly and changing relationships so rapidly, that the very attempt to answer this question is like, what's the right metaphor? It's like the whole society is changing so fast that whatever answer you come up with today, well, your children are going to disagree because they're different from you. Let me show you what I mean by that. There's a wonderful data set, which I think we should mine more in positive psychology. The World Values Survey started in Europe, but quickly expanded to cover most of the countries on Earth now. And in each country, they give a representative sample, a large number of value questions, and then they do a factor analysis, or multidimensional scaling, I should say, on all the items, and they find that there's a kind of a map of the world. You can group countries together in a two-dimensional space based on their values. And here are the two dimensions. The vertical dimension is traditional to secular rational. So almost all societies were once very religious, based on a lot of ritual practice, oriented towards the past, traditions, family, authority. And then many societies, especially when they industrialize, they change, they become more secular and rational. That's one dimension. The other dimension is when life is dangerous, you can't count on the future, your children might die, there's no reason to put money aside for 50 years from now when you retire because who knows what will happen. People tend to rely on family, there's a lot of corruption, they don't trust faraway institutions, so those are survival values. And as countries get wealthier, they tend to move to the right towards what they call emancipative values, more freedom-loving, individualistic, self-expressive. And so you might think, you can't really read, in the bottom left are the Islamic countries, in the upper right is Protestant Europe, especially Scandinavia, the Confucian countries in the upper left, and the English-speaking countries are on the right edge there. The USA is below the word speaking, and then Canada, New Zealand, Britain, Australia are above the word speaking there. So that's the general lay of the land, and you might think that, well, obviously, so Zimbabwe is in the bottom left, obviously, as countries get richer, they move up and to the right. But it's more interesting than that. What Engelhardt and his colleagues find is that it's a two-step process, and this is so interesting. So every society once had traditional values, very religious, very ritual-oriented. And then they get factories. And ritual really doesn't fit with industrial capitalism. You have to fit yourself to the machine. You have to fit yourself to whatever its power source is and its vagaries. So when countries industrialize, they get less religious, they become very materialist. Everybody wants money, and it looks ugly. And this is what Karl Marx saw in the 19th century. And I think this step is what gives capitalism such a bad name all around the world. Because that first step people move from traditional values to materialist values. They want money. But the values it takes to interact with a machine are not the values you need to interact with people. And so as countries move beyond factories and they take up a service economy, then they move to the right. And what happens when they move to the right? They become more trusting, they want more freedom for themselves, and they want to give more freedom to others. They start caring about women's rights, human rights, animal rights, the environment, gay rights. So especially for people on the left who tend to have a negative view of capitalism, in part because of that first step, well, the second step, in a sense, pushes people to progressive values. It's summarized in this really interesting book by Christian Welzel, one of the main researchers, that prosperity and security lead to these emancipatory values. And here's the central quote: "Fading existential pressures," that is, when you no longer are afraid that you or your children will die, that opens people's minds, and that makes them prioritize freedom over security, autonomy over authority, diversity over uniformity, and creativity over discipline. And so when I would show this graph, when I traveled across Asia, I'd give talks. When I'd show this graph, all the cameras would come out because people want to know what's happening to us. These societies are changing so rapidly, and people want to know what's happening to us. So I spent a lot of time in the confusion, the Chinese-speaking country, well, Korea included, but Korea, China, Hong Kong, and then Japan is up there in the upper, way above it, because Japan industrialized 50 to 100 years before everyone else in Asia. And they developed a service economy before everybody else. So in a sense, Japan is several generations further along. And so the question arises, what is going to happen to all these countries? Is this their trajectory? Are all of these Asian countries going to end up in 2 or 3 generations where Sweden is today? It's possible. Or they could end up maybe a little bit lower down. I don't really know. The point is, they're not going to move to the left or down unless something terrible, catastrophic happens. The general movement is in that direction. What I can say with confidence is that the biggest generation gap in human history is now playing out all across Asia, much bigger than the one we had here with the baby boomers versus the greatest generation. What I saw in so many countries is that most people in Asia have parents or grandparents, or they themselves, grew up with war, famine, governments that killed people. Not in every country, but in most countries, things were terrible for a while, and then things changed. And young people are so different. Their values are so different. And what kind of capitalism they would want is so different. For example, a Korean economics professor, he said, we were talking after I gave a talk, he said, well, there are 3 generations that he's taught here in Korea. He said, those born in the 70s are still influenced by the struggle against the military dictatorship that happened in the 1980s. Those born in the 80s, when there were no more existential pressures, they're the ones who want more freedom. They grew up with they were the first Koreans to grow up with peace and prosperity. And then he said, those born in the 90s, I haven't figured them out yet. His current students, he said, they're not Korean. And I heard this sentiment several times in different Asian countries. The young people today, they're not, us. They're like aliens or something. Now, one of these aliens said, most of the older people don't want change. They want to keep things as they are. They have a fear of change. My generation, they want to make change, make a new kind of society. So things are really changing rapidly, rapidly. Because of this, capitalism is the most transformative force since the domestication of fire. So it's very hard to figure out what kind of capitalism we want because our children are different from us, at least in those countries that are changing rapidly. And here I'll just now I'll address one of the concerns that people have. How many of you, when you saw this graph, how many of you found it thrilling? Like, wow, that is great that things are developing so fast. Raise your hand if you found that thrilling. Okay. Raise your hand if you had any negative feelings, like, whoa, this can't go on this way. Okay. And I'm guessing most of you that are on the left, and perhaps one of your main concerns was environmental concerns, because with global warming is serious, and rich people produce a lot more carbon than poor people. So there are reasons for alarm, I understand that. But here's a funny way to look at it. Because the question is, should we slow down? Should we go back to the old ways? What do we do about environmental problems or other problems? What do we do? Forward or back? Well, rising prosperity brings rising security, which, as I said, as Engelhardt says, changes people's values. They grow up with those emancipative values. So that the change in values, they want freedom and rights for everybody. That causes rising education, and now women get educated. When you move to the right, then all the women get educated. On the far left, they tend not to in that graph. Rising education, which then causes the demographic transition. When women are not educated and there is insecurity and you don't know if your kids are going to survive, families have huge numbers of children. But as soon as you get women educated and some security, the fertility rate drops to 2 or below. And in many Asian countries, like in many European countries, it's like 1.3, 1.4. So people are going to disappear pretty soon from Europe and Asia. Well, not quite, but it does bring a shrinking population. And then that finally brings relief for the environment. And it's not just population, because with progress comes decreasing dependence on carbon per unit of output, and come new technologies, as we're seeing, solar and better batteries. Technology also holds out great hope that we can break the cycle, which is destroying the environment now. So perhaps the solution is not slow down and go back to old ways. Perhaps the solution is faster, faster, faster. We need to get there before we cause catastrophic change to the environment. So in conclusion, I've said that the initial idea of positive psychology, that there would be these 3 areas of focus, we were sort of behind. It was hard to work on the third one, the good society, positive institutions, but we're making progress. There's a lot more now on business and capitalism. And I've said that capitalism I think we should welcome it and then try to improve it, try to correct the defects that we see. I think it has to be part of the story of positive psychology. I've suggested 3 features of a positive psychology approach to capitalism. And that is my answer ultimately to Marty's question of how can we increase the total tonnage of happiness. It is get capitalism right. Thank you. So what's it? Well, thanks very much. I don't know if we have any time for questions. If not, I'll just stay around. Where are we on the schedule? No time. OK, so I'll hang around here and happy to talk to people. I'm sorry there's no time for a group session, but thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome back to Positive Psychology. Well, if anybody wonders if there's anything new in positive psychology, they should have been here at this session. That's really fascinating. And it'll take us a while, I think, to process through all the nuances of what you've said. I guess the only request I would have is any way you could move forward the publication date of your book, maybe 2016 or something like that. I think you will sell quite a few copies when you are able to publish it. So thanks again for being with us. Just a couple of very brief announcements. Excuse me. Remember that the SIPA Idea Bounce and the China meeting are tonight. Also, for those of you who are interested in the Soaring Words event tomorrow evening, a little bit of movement, some Zumba, some pro-social activity, creating things that will be delivered to kids in hospitals. Those tickets can be purchased. It's a separate ticket that you will get near the registration desk. There are volunteers now. You can get your ticket now and avoid the very long lines that we will have tomorrow evening as people seek to gain entry to the event. Well, we have come to the end of a very full and wonderful day. Thank you again to, this morning I asked the presenters who were going to present today to stand. The rest of us, how well did they do in their sessions today? Thank you so very much. We look forward to a wonderful day tomorrow. Coffee will begin at 7 o'clock in the exhibit hall. We'll be back here for another wonderful day at 8 o'clock a.m. Please be here on time and ready to go. In the meantime, have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.